Today we will look at the African American experience after Reconstruction. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were geared towards improving the lives of African Americans in a post-slavery America, what we will see is the division of America into two parts, one white, the other black. We will meet Jim Crow and look at other ways African Americans had their rights taken away. All of this would be deemed legal by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson. Finally, we will consider how African Americans responded to this treatment. Differing voices emerged on what action should be taken, and many African Americans will ultimately decide just to leave the South. These Reconstruction amendments that were designed to improve the lives of African Americans included the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which said that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and that all citizens were equal under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. By the time Reconstruction ended, these amendments to the Constitution amounted to promises not kept by the radical Republicans during Reconstruction as a result of forces in the South. These forces in the South were led by people known as Redeemers. These were individuals who wanted to go back to the pre-Civil War days where there was the white power structure over African Americans. Led by Democratic politicians, remember, Republicans were the party of Lincoln, and Democrats were primarily the Southern Party in the election of 1860. These Redeemers would reclaim control of the South after Reconstruction ended in 1877. They were able to control the South through racism, using laws, violence, and intimidation to ultimately make African Americans second-class citizens in the South. And they would use Jim Crow laws to divide the South, one part white, one part black. When Reconstruction ended following the Compromise of 1877, discrimination and segregation became prevalent in the South. Many African Americans were forced to work as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, which put them under control of the same white landowners who owned slaves during the Civil War. We'll see the races segregated in almost all parts of life, be it restaurants, water fountains, restrooms, and many other public accommodations. We'll also see violence from many whites to keep African Americans from voting, owning businesses, and living in their neighborhoods. Jim Crow laws, which were named after Thomas Rice's 1830s minstrel show Jump Jim Crow, were laws in the South that separated the races. Schools, hospitals, and transportation systems would be separated by Jim Crow laws, which served as the catalyst that would divide the South. These Jim Crow laws said that there would be two Bibles in courts for people to swear on, one for whites, one for African Americans. This law in Alabama says that if restaurants were to serve whites and African Americans in the same room, they could, as long as there was a 7-foot wall in between the two races. Also, there needed to be separate entrances. Alabama also had a law that said that it was illegal for a white man and a black man to play pool either against or around each other. Marriage between the races was illegal, and in Florida, a law said it was illegal for someone who was white to marry someone who had someone African American in their family going back 4 generations. It's worth noting that laws against interracial marriage would not go away until after the Loving v. Virginia case in 1967. In Georgia, cemeteries were segregated. African Americans cannot be buried in areas that were set aside for whites. Water fountains and Coke machines were separated, parks and baseball fields. This law from Georgia says that baseball fields for whites and African Americans had to be at least 2 blocks apart. And of course, schools were separated throughout the South. There were also laws regarding textbooks. I'll let you guess who got the newer editions. Movie theaters and trains had separate sections for people to sit depending on the color of their skin. In Georgia, black barbers could not cut the hair of white females, and bars could not serve the races in the same room. They either sold to white patrons or black patrons. These Jim Crow laws and many more would be the law in the South until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was less than 60 years ago. Violence and intimidation were used as a way to control African Americans in the South. The prime use of violence was lynchings through vigilante mobs. Instead of trying African Americans in courts, lynch mobs executed African Americans in public. During the 1890s, there were about 187 lynchings each year in the United States. 3/4 of these took place in the South. And as you can see, these took place in public where all could see, and the goal was to intimidate African Americans. Franchise is another word for the right to vote. African Americans were given the right to vote through the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Policies implemented throughout the South would ultimately deny the franchise to most African Americans. Literacy tests were reading tests one must pass in order to vote. These tests were not equal, with whites getting maybe a sentence and African Americans getting an entire paragraph from the Constitution. Voters could be disqualified for mispronouncing a word. There was a high number of African Americans who had never been to school and thus could not read, but there were also many poor whites who could not read. The poll tax was a tax one had to pay in order to vote, and again, this impacted African Americans and poor whites. The last thing used, which would ensure that whites who maybe could not pass the literacy test and could not pay the poll tax could vote and ensure that African Americans could not vote, was the grandfather clause. One could vote assuming his father or grandfather had voted before January 1, 1867. The 15th Amendment was not ratified until 1870, so it was safe to assume that almost all African Americans were not voting before January 1, 1867. An example of the impact of these practices: in South Carolina, over 130,000 African Americans voted in 1896, but just over 1,300 voted in 1904, a decline of 99%. These would be common practice in the South until the 24th Amendment in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, again, less than 60 years ago. Homer Plessy tried to challenge the Louisiana law that said there must be separate sections for races on railway cars. This case got to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that Jim Crow laws separating the races were legal as long as there were equal accommodations. Of course, these accommodations were never equal. But this phrase, separate but equal, would lead to legalized segregation in the United States for nearly 60 years, when the Supreme Court would reverse its ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case in 1954. There were early voices for civil rights for African Americans who would be influential on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Ida Wells was born a slave and actually won a case when she sued a railroad company in Tennessee for making her give up a seat on a train. Three of Wells's friends who owned a successful grocery store in Memphis that was a competitor to white-owned stores were lynched in 1892. This event led Wells to launch an international anti-lynching campaign. And a quote from Wells: "This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of Negroes who had acquired wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized." Another voice was Booker T. Washington, also born a slave, who believed in a more gradual pathway to equality. Washington argued for African Americans to accept segregation and work on improving themselves economically and not worry as much about politics. He argued that African Americans should focus on vocational training like agriculture and carpentry, things that they already knew, and they would eventually achieve equality. This patient, gradual approach was embraced by Southern whites. Washington gave a famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895 where he outlined his beliefs before a predominantly white audience. A quote from Washington: "No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem." A last voice was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. As the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard, W.E.B. Du Bois, as he was known, believed education was a key part for African American advancement. But education did nothing if African Americans were not seen as equal. Unlike Washington, Du Bois demanded immediate equality for African Americans. He helped to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. The NAACP would play a large role in the successes of the civil rights movement later in the 20th century. Du Bois was also a harsh critic of Booker T. Washington's gradual approach, believing Washington's approach appealed to whites in the South and had betrayed the African American race. A quote from Du Bois: "Persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty." Let's close the show by looking at the Great Migration. At the turn of the 20th century, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. What we see in the early 20th century was a mass movement of some 1.7 million African Americans out of the South into northern cities between the years 1910 and 1930. African Americans will primarily move into cities like New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland because these were industrial centers at the time. The reasons for this migration included the Jim Crow laws that restricted the rights of African Americans in the South. There were more jobs in northern factories. There were restrictive immigration laws at the time that opened up even more opportunities for African Americans. Also, there were crop failures in the South during this time period that led many African Americans to leave. This migration would change the North, which did not accept African Americans with open arms, but as we move into the 20th century, America was changing. We'll talk about immigration next time, and until then, good night, Albuquerque.